Have you ever wondered why certain megachurches swing the pendulum of our church cultures today? How have these huge churches gotten to where they are? Join us today as we talk about the Emergent church movement. Welcome to the Happy Holy Hour, a podcast where everyday Christians grow in their faith through biblical examination and insightful discussion. I'm glad you're here today. If you enjoy the content you're about to hear, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and visit us at thehappyholyhour.org. Let's get started. How are you, Travis?
I am a little in a haze, but I'm good. I'm tired.
You sleepy?
I am. I've been muting my mic over here, yawning. Not because your intro is so boring.
I'm glad you clarified that. Yeah. Travis, today we're going to talk about just a little bit of our church culture a little bit. I know we talk about that frequently on our podcast, but we're going to hone in.
Our tagline.
Yeah, we're going to hone in and talk about the Emergent church, which, Travis, I don't know if you've noticed, I know we've talked about this a little bit, but the current state of church culture largely revolves around what the big mega churches are doing.
Mm-hmm.
Many evangelical churches get their preaching styles from these large churches. Even their worship music, they get them from these large churches. Even their branding style and their church design. What are your thoughts on that? Like, we take such an influence from them.
Well, I think a part of it is natural, right? I think even maybe you could look back through church history, and there's been different times where there's been some influential churches that had a positive impact, right? You might have a very famous preacher and their ministry, and that kind of trickles down into some of the smaller, parishes throughout the land.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So I think part of it's natural, right? Like, and even today we have very well-known churches and ministries and theologians and pastors who we think are really solid, and we're thankful for that influence, right? But I think that can also be negative, and maybe there's a bit of a difference here too. I don't know. It could be either way, but more now than ever, I think it's kind of a negative thing.
I guess we see that people like to imitate what seems to be working, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously, in the eyes of the evangelical world, these churches that have 40,000 members, there must be something they're doing right. So we want to imitate that. Like, that's kind of what you see happening.
Well, I think that's right where we would say, like, some of these other positive influences, it was because of the work that God was doing and convicting people and changing lives, and because of the biblical preaching and the solid doctrine and all these different things, and I'm thinking of different times too where there wasn't a lot of that, right? And so you said someone come along who was doing what was right, and it was so refreshing, so powerful, so different that people were attracted to that in a good way. But nowadays, I wonder if it's more of a pragmatic desire, or more of a worldly desire, and that we want to be the big name too, right? We want to have our own record label, worship team, and
in the world of influencers, you want to be the influencer, right?
Right. And we want to have all the celebrities come to our churches and that kind of thing. Obviously, we don't know every single person's heart, but just looking at from the outside in, that's certainly the way it would seem. But I'm sure someone would counter argue that maybe.
Oh, for sure. Well, you've heard the big names, right? You've heard Elevation Church, Hillsong. You've heard of Bethel. You've heard of Mars Hill. That's another one that's on the fringe that used to exist. But all of these churches have been trendsetters in the Christian world for quite some time. And how did that happen? How did these churches become so well known and so influential? So we're going to try to walk through that a little today, why these churches are really how they got to where they're at. And we're not going to do it justice by trying to walk through the entire history of the Emergent church movement in 30 minutes. So we're going to stay pretty high level. So if you want to know more, you want to get deeper, make sure you do your own research. So I'm going to try to story tell this a little today to keep it interesting. So imagine it's 1960. Postmodernism is starting to make its way through the land, right? New music styles are coming to exist. Cinemas are more popular, right? The age of entertainment is booming. Everything begins to revolve around experience. You know, it matters how much fun you're having while you're at the roller rink, or how entertained you are while you're going to a movie or going to a concert. Experience seemed to sweep the land in a way it has really never been done before. So progress through the 1980s and the 90s. You have decades worth of people now coming through, I would call it maybe the age of entertainment, where many people have grown up with the mindset of entertainment, right? What can be consumed? What is my experience while I consume it? It's really the start of a world of entertainment and consumerism, right? So the culture is all about how can I be entertained? How can I consume this? What's my experience like? So that's where the focus tended to be at this time, and it still is now. But this is where we see it happening.
Well, I wonder too if, I mean, certainly see postmodernism coming through during that time, but as far as the entertainment and everything, I feel like some of these, you can see this starting to work its way out, even in the 1800s, and kind of like the Second Great Awakening with Charles Finney, and the Third Great Awakening, and then you had like movements like D.L. Moody and then Billy Graham and things like that, where well, especially people like D.L. Moody. I think I mentioned this maybe one time before on an episode, where his music director, like his ministries, they were kind of the ones to change music to be more appealing, with the purpose of being more appealing to non-churched people. Right.
Yeah.
So your music becomes more outward focused and your preaching becomes more outward. So in other words, like that, there was a shift from, your liturgy being for the church versus how can we make this more appealing to attract large numbers. And so that kind of tactic, which was replicated a lot by Billy Graham, and for all the good things people say about him, he also had some negative sides of things where, was partnering with obviously, the Roman Catholic Church and other non-Christian religions, a kind of very, like we talked about the non-healthy ecumenical style and everything, but, trying to attract large numbers and trying to become a movement. It was this focus off of the local church and local community to kind of become something larger than yourself, right? Which is a lot of these people, it's more than just building. We're all this, and you have multi-site, you have all this going on. It's really this whole and a more CEO, like large corporate organizational structure, this very large nebulous organization, right? Kind of changed the whole idea of what a church would look like.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if those earlier movements also had an effect on this.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the writings of, say, J. Gresham Machen on liberalism in the early 20th century and postmodernism starting to come about. It all is kind of flushing together with, you see the culture advancing in one direction, with just like everything is relevant, postmodernism, entertainment culture, consumer culture. And so now what we're getting into is that's with culture's moving. What's the American church look like at this point, right? So you look at the 1980s, 1990s in America, and you look at the churches, and many of them at this point have been around for 100+ years, right? Which is awesome. And they have gotten into these like routines and traditions that may mark them as quote unquote boring or dry. And you may have encountered young people at the time basically asking the question, right? These old churches are just boring, right? Like I want to be entertained. I want something to keep my attention. And you saw authors coming through this time in the 90s, early 2000s, like Rob Bell and Brian McLaren, who are writing books about, new ways to do church so that churches can stay culturally relevant, because they saw culture was changing in one way and they were trying to figure out how the church can keep up with it, so to speak. But during this time, there was a big push in the church to embrace postmodernism, especially from influences like Brian McLaren and Rob Bell. And more authors came forward, more than just these two came to tear down what the church was in order to build what they thought the church could be. And this included everything from, how the church platform or stage looks to how your service teams operated, even trying to change doctrine that the church has held dear to for thousands of years. And needless to say, because of all of this, right, this movement also involves a lot of folks dealing with deconstructionism and all that stuff.
Yeah. Do you think, I was just trying to think, because the whole doctrine thing, right? I mean, that's kind of a core of liberalism in general, right? Rejecting of orthodoxy, in an attempt to be more appealing to ourselves, to mankind, to the outside world and society. I think that's a large part of it. So, which, like you said, was already happening for quite some time. But I feel like this emergent church has some pretty, recognizable characteristics. And so, that maybe, the early liberal churches wouldn't really fit into that. And so I wonder, if it's kind of taking a couple different streams of change that had already been occurring and bringing it together and repackaging it in a new way, right? So, and I wonder, if some of that had, you had the Jesus freak movement and CCM, and what's interesting there, whether you love it or hate it, it really was a attempt to Christianize different genres of music and culture, right? We had you had the whole rock scene, right, which was, had virtually no Christian influence, at least for a long time, right? And so Christians had to come up with their own, right, version of that, so they had their Christian version of this, Christian version of that, and even you had Christian films kind of becoming a thing too. Which really, I don't think I don't know if you had that before. Did you have the Christian version of this, the Christian version of that? I feel like that was kind of a product of, 60s on, really. I mean, I think even with 70s, maybe 80s on, I don't know. So you had this, because liberal churches didn't have this modern feel to it. And in fact, some still don't. They might have a very traditional Orthodox feel to their liturgy, right? You walk into a PCUSA church and it might not feel or look that different in some ways from a conservative Presbyterian church or something like that, where Emergent church, you kind of know when you're entry because it looks very modern, and I think that's part of it. So they're taking things, they're taking elements from the liberal church, but they're also wanting to modernize that because they see that as also still being old school and dead and boring or whatever.
Well, you see that the emergent church movement, even at its core, it has roots in liberalism and progressivism, because as we'll see later on, one of the things that the emergent church tried to do was basically tear away any strong stance on doctrine for the sake of, say, unity in the church, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that has the same desire as those in the liberal Christian movement, because in the liberal Christian movement, they don't want to talk about those hard lines because they don't believe there's any hard lines. But when you had the emergent church kind of standing up and doing the same thing, we'll let the main thing stay the main thing. We won't worry about any of the minor things. Basically, they were trying to do the same thing in a sense, get rid of any of those hard stances on doctrine because they didn't want to offend anybody. And we'll actually, that's one of the things that I think when you look at a emergent church website, you can see very clearly that it's an emergent church because it's very shallow in its doctrine and belief statement, typically speaking.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me that you still have that kind of like classic liberal church. And then you have the emergent church, and like you said, you can kind of tell from the website, one still feels kind of very traditional, yet very liberal and progressive, and one feels this new modern thing.
Well, we all have these desires, right? Whether we like it or not, it's in our blood, essentially, that we want to be entertained. We want to consume. We want something that will keep our attention. It's just how we were raised in this culture, but that doesn't mean that's how it should be, right? So many church leaders knew this coming into this time period, and they wanted to start churches that would shed all of the boring, quote unquote, boring traditions and methods and create exciting new ways to encounter God. And they shed things like traditions, like I mentioned, but even like linguistics and language. They stopped using the Christian terms that have been used for a very long time: regeneration, justification, the big words that they were like, we got to soften things and make it easier for outsiders to understand, which, hey, I understand that, but they were tearing away things that the church has used for a very long time. And like I mentioned earlier, even doctrine, Rob Bell wrote a book that basically made a case that hell isn't hell. It's not a literal existent place. So there were these core doctrines they were trying to tear away for the sake of trying to get away from the old traditions and bring something new up. And essentially what this was is it's conforming to culture, right? There were many churches that wanted to match what the culture was doing, and they wanted to keep up with it. And while this might sound admirable, they actually set the church up for a really big problem. There's some big issues here, right? So as the culture was embracing postmodern thought, and it has been for a long time, so did the church. If you're trying to mirror the culture, you're like, it's no surprise that postmodernism is going to sneak into the church. So experience became what people were looking for in the church, right? They wanted to feel good. They wanted to feel welcome. They wanted their experience to be positive. They wanted their worship music to be loud and powerful. They wanted the preacher to be funny and captivating. They stopped passing offering plates because no one liked being asked for money. They stopped publicly posting their doctrine and belief statements online because it was too alienating. So you had this really, I would call it a soft church breaking through in the culture that was just very interesting to look. A new type of church was emerging, right? The emergent church movement was coming to light. New churches are being born. Hillsong was planted in the 80s. Elevation was planted in 2006. And these small churches at the time, as they embraced emergent church ideas, right? Soft theology, pragmatism, they exploded in growth because that's what people wanted to hear. And then they became the culture drivers that they have become today. So very interesting movement. Obviously, we just covered the entire history of the emergent church in about 15 minutes. So I'd do your research, look deeper than what you're hearing on this podcast, because there's a lot of interesting books out there, a lot of interesting articles. I encourage you to dive deeper and do your own research. But Travis, I didn't want this whole episode to just be like tearing down on the emergent church movement. I wanted to admonish it to some level, right? There are some good things that we can acknowledge from this movement, or at least some motivations that we can acknowledge. No. Well, I think surface level. So for example, there were these churches that wanted to do everything and anything they could to reach people for Jesus, right? They were hosting outreaches in their communities, nights of worship, leading special series on relevant issues in the church culture. Right, that's something that we could say, you know what? Yeah, like that's cool. There are undoubtedly thousands of people that have been introduced to Jesus through these ministries and movements. That's cool, right? But they strive for unity. But I would argue at what cost?
Yeah. Well, I think that's where, and again, like, you don't want to be too harsh, but that's where and I know this shocks some people, that's where I put a little damper on like the whole, even the Billy Graham movement. There was, I was listening to one broadcast, and they were talking about like a co-member of Billy Graham's who ran with Billy Graham for a long time, but after changing his doctrinal theological views and kind of seeing it for what he thought it was, he realized that it wasn't all it was worked up to be. Like all these things, and kind of the same, like, let's do whatever we can and partner with whoever we need to, and let's reach the thousands and reach the masses with the gospel and everything like that. But after doing studies and surveys, he realized, I think it was only 2% of all those people, who walked the aisle and whatever, altar call, all of that, had any ongoing involvement in Christianity in general and church membership and was living a Christian life, so did some people truly get saved? Yes. But did it cause more harm than good? I don't know. Those are the kinds, and this is kind of a similar situation where I think it's admirable, in one sense that, yes, we want to reach the masses with the gospel, but how we go about doing that matters too. And sometimes we can cause more harm than good. So not to,
absolutely.
Yeah, just putting that out there. So,
well, and that's where we're actually going next. So there's some concerns that, we have to recognize when we look at the emergent church movement, which now that you've kind of understood what the emergent church movement is, you kind of understand, okay, it's these churches that they're trying to be really hip, relevant with culture, a lot of mega churches.
Like an old person. They were trying to be really hip.
Coffee in the foyer. But you kind of understand the feel of the churches we're talking about. Not that every church that has that feel is emergent, but that was where the emergent church kind of was leaning towards. That's where they were going to. But there's some issues that come to light, right? Number one, and we're going to build on this a little bit, but there was this consumer attitude versus an active participant in being the church. So we'll talk in a minute why experiences are so important to people involved in the ECM, emergent church movement. But when we focus on experience, we become the consumer rather than the active part of the church. So when you start looking at your congregants as, okay, how can I entertain them? How can I keep their heads in it? How can they have a good experience? Now you're looking at, you're basically having a business mindset on what's the product, how do I keep the customer happy, rather than looking at it as a church perspective. These are my sheep and I need to feed them. So that's a problem. And Travis, how valuable are consumers to the local church? What do consumers do?
Well, do you want the biblical answer or the Western answer?
Give me it. Give me the answer.
I mean, consumers, depends on who are your consumers, right? And what are you consuming? I don't know, not to get too deep and philosophical on you. That's a weighty answer. Let me preface it with this. It's interesting in a Bible study I've been going through. We've been working through The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self by Carl Trueman, and we were talking about Karl Marx's idea of self-creation, and Carl Trueman used the example of consumerism to see how this plays out in society, and all that to say, this idea of we can create ourselves, and the consumer is the ultimate, right? We try to create ourselves by consuming, and obviously his point, and he fleshes out on how that obviously doesn't work. We can't just become whatever we want to be, and no matter what we buy or what we do or purchase or all of this, this consumeristic pursuit will never satisfy. All that, say, really, it does nothing. It won't satisfy. The consumer shouldn't be our primary target as the church.
Well, and if you look at who is the consumer, if it's the person sitting in the pew, then what's the product? The product is the preaching, is the music. Now you're trying to make your product as interesting as possible to keep the consumer into it, and that's not how we should be looking at church.
Kind of reminds me of that passage where it's talking about peddling the gospel,
tickling their ears. Yeah. So when you have consumers, they, what do? They're gonna sit there passively in the church seat. They're going to listen and watch what happens, and they're going to go home. And then they may talk about what they disliked or liked about the service, and then they're going to continue living the rest of the week, totally forgetting.
Another problem is in consumerism, you need to find out what the consumer wants in order to sell it. And you're going to produce what the consumer wants, right? If you know nobody's going to buy it, you're not going to produce it because no one's going to buy it, right? It's not going to be profitable. So if you're coming at it from a consumer mindset, then, which we know, and I think maybe we mentioned this before as well, which we know, like, the gospel is going to be offensive, right? It's not what the world wants to hear, and those who are in rebellion want to hear. It's what they need to hear. So if we're just trying to to look at the numbers and get people in the door and attract them and be attractive to them, we're going to have to not preach the gospel and not do things in a biblical way, right? Because that is not attractive to the world in one sense. So I think that's the other thing too. If you're doing it at that model, right, then you're going to be tempted to, or you eventually have to, in order to grow, not focus on hard topics and things which the world doesn't like. So
yeah, well, and you think about that's absolutely right. And you think about the Bible is very clear that the church, or we're not consumers, right? Mm-hmm. We exist to storm the gates of hell, right? Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." In that phrase, the gates of hell it's a defensive phrase there, as in the church is on the offensive, right? So we have a mission, we have a purpose. We don't exist just to sit there and leave Yelp reviews or Google reviews on how our church service went according to our carnal desires. But Acts 2:42 says they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And we see that in this passage, the church devotes themselves actively by submitting to the apostles' teachings, by gathering together, by taking part in the Lord's Supper. It's an active tense here. Yeah. This is something we're doing. We're not just sitting there receiving everything, to the liking of our carnal desires. We're actually taking part in this.
Well, I think another kind of point there, as we talked about the regulative principle in the past, and this idea that God has a way he wants to be worshipped. God has laid out the functions of the church and how we are to function as a church, reading through Timothy and things like that. And so if you're coming at it from a consumeristic mindset, then you're going to have to reject that. If you're going to try to attract the world, you're not going to be able to run the church the way God has told us to run the church. Because first off, it wasn't made for the world, so this whole idea that, the way we run church and the way we do church is for the world, well, that's actually not true.
Romans 12:4-5 says, "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another," right? So the church is that we are active people involved in performing a function of the church, and not everyone has the same function, but we work together so that the entire body may function properly. When I look at the human body, I don't see any passive body parts that just exist for the purpose of entertainment.
Right.
Everything has a purpose. Everything has a function to be used in a proper way. Yeah. And all of these parts are to be actively involved in the functioning of the body.
I think that, just because when you look at a lot of these emergent churches and their style, whether it be their style of music or their style of preaching, all these things, it is more, even though you don't always realize it, right? A concert is obviously, I guess if you're in the mosh pit, you're kind of participating in a sense, but it's entertainment. And so you are consuming that entertainment versus participating in that. There's something very different from a participatory liturgy of the congregation versus a show that the church puts on, and a lot of the music today, like even when you look at like the way it's performed, it's not so much like, is this going to be something that the congregation can sing along to? It's like, is this something that's entertaining? And then
how can I create a mood
and a sermon? And the way we even build our buildings today, it's very interesting.
Well, and I just have to say this before we move on, to the church member out there who may be feeling like they are a consumer, or that their church is structured so that they become a consumer. Listen, if what you were made for, if God just made you just to be a passive consumer on something, first of all, that's not the God who made you. That's not how you were made. That's actually incredibly insulting. That's a waste of time to make something that's there just to consume, right? God made you for so much more. He made you to be an active part in the body, to be serving, to like you have a purpose, right? So don't fall into that mindset that I'm just here to consume. And I know most consumers, that's not their mindset. But I think when we step back and we actually examine how we do church, a lot of us might fall into that consumer category.
Yeah, it's just one thing, like as consumer versus participant, like as far as mega churches, I was listening to this one survey that they were doing of these mega churches, and the one thing that even a lot of them confess is they don't do a good job in discipleship. Part of the reason is that you really can't at that size and that structure. You know, like I remember going to a large church down in Florida when I was down there as a student. Before even then I was like, I just don't understand how this is a thing, right? You walk in, it's huge, and you're just like a number, like no one knows you. And obviously, like, yeah, maybe if you were there for a long time, but you could be there for years, and even if you were part of one small group, you could go your whole entire life there in that little clique and not know 95% of the rest of the church, you know, like not only that, but they had their huge coffee shop and all that. It's just like, it was so weird. I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't get it, but
it's hard to be the church when you don't know anybody in the church. But anyway, so the second concern, and this kind of builds off the first one, is this emphasis on experience rather than doctrine. So postmodernism has made its way into the church, causing people to have a worldly worldview rather than a biblical worldview. So what does the world say? The world said there's no truth, can't know the truth, there's no absolute truth. Who you are is who you are. You define truth. What you feel is truth. But that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says that God's word is truth, right? That God is God and you are not. So when post-modernity, when the culture seeps into the church, we have some problems here. So the culture was and is postmodernism. When we structure our churches to look like culture, we become like the culture. And churches in the ECM, just one thing to note is they make it very clear that they do not hold strong to doctrine, at least on a public scale.
Emergent church movement, for those who didn't make connection.
Emergent church movement. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So doctrine, and this is all stuff that emergent church pastors have said / articles written by emergent church folks, is that doctrine offends while experiences are welcoming. And this is a strong tendency for ECM churches to strive for. They strive for this ecumenical unity, which basically, if you're unfamiliar with that means, it means unity at all costs, even if it means overlooking a very serious, even heretical error in their doctrine. So there's an issue here because you see elements of postmodernity here where we're coming together and we're going to unify as the church, even if we really don't even have a good definition of what the church itself is. And so that becomes a problem because truth is not clearly defined. Doctrine is not clearly defined. And that's an issue. And kind of going off of that, as leaders began to structure their services around experiences rather than what the Bible has to say about what worship looks like. You would hear questions like, how can we capitalize off this moment? Or right, I want to use this moment to do X, Y, or Z while people are feeling a certain way. And this is dangerous because now we're getting into the realm where churches are manipulating emotions to get across certain points. And this is a dangerous place to be because rather than letting the word of God transform the hearts of the people, many emergent pastors were trying to manipulate the people's minds, kind of taking that out of God's
when, like the
hands.
synthesizer on the keyboard is like slowly playing in the background, like
giving you that warm feeling.
In this moment, I just want to, if anybody's, I know I can still hear it. I still have PTSD.
Well, that's what happens is those moments are not just accidental; they are planned. Even those spontaneous moments
are
planned.
Spontaneous.
Yeah,
they're having a church meeting like somewhere with their whatever service team.
Yeah, and I don't want to paint a negative brush on everybody that does this, but this is something that commonly happens in the emergent church movement, where emotions are king in a way, and Yeah.
I never understood that. I mean, maybe some people enjoy it. It was just always like irritating to me. Like just let the pastor pray. Okay. It's not about you, keyboardist. It's not about you. Nobody cares.
Yep. Yeah. And how do we defend against this?
Not play
right. Everybody's like, okay, get rid of every instrument.
Every keyboard.
But
I know I
seriously,
offended somebody out there. Like, I play the keyboard.
I play the keyboard somewhat, not well
enough to fill in while the pastor's praying. I think a toddler
well enough
could
to
do
hold that one note.
Like, just hold your finger down right here, Jeff. Okay, now hold your finger down right here. Okay, now take this one off and put it back on.
Keep your foot on the sustain pedal. Keep it going.
Yeah.
But how do we defend against this? And the answer is by having strong doctrine that is clear and well taught. And I just want to bring in, here's what John Piper had to say when he stated his concerns about the emergent church movement, specifically their lack of doctrinal commitments. He said this, he said, the single greatest concern for me is their attitude towards doctrine. Stylistic things are neither here or there. They come and go. Whether you meet in a home or meet in a church, sit in a circle or sit in rows, paint on the walls or not, they are all just peripheral issues. They're the wineskins, not the wine. The issue is their attitude towards truth. I'm deeply concerned about it, and I think that it will be the undoing of the emergent church as it has come to be. They don't believe that truth itself is an objective propositional thing that has a yes or a no. Nothing is ever either or, good or bad, right or wrong, ugly or beautiful. It's all vague. I've talked with some emergent types and tried to understand even their concept of truth, and you can't get your hand around it. Here's a typical kind of response. One person made an accusation that the emergent church's view of doctrine is like trying to nail Jell-O to the wall. I mentioned that to one of them, and his response to me was, why would you want to nail Jell-O to the wall? That's clever, right? Yes, it is, but it shows that the Jell-O is there. You just don't nail it to the wall. You eat Jell-O, you cut it in cubes, etc. You don't nail it to the wall. So all of this nailing to the wall of theses, doctrines that you would subscribe to, they're not at home with that kind of talk. They regard their position here as a virtue, I think, but I regard it as the undoing of their movement. So that's just an interesting...
Yeah. It's so true, though. Like, just thinking of the people I've listened to or I've talked to personally or known, like, who would kind of subscribe to this movement, or, well, really now I think it's more progressive Christianity, emergent church movement. Yeah. I mean, you could say it's still ongoing, but I feel it's had a time, right? And it's now progressed to like people would now call it progressive Christianity, which I think was birthed out of the emergent church movement, but maybe is its own like phase of it. I don't know. But it's so true. Like you can't, if like trying to debate one of them, like there's no coherent, because it's like, oh, well, that's good for you. And it's a journey, a spiritual journey, or like all this like talk of virtue and stuff. It's very interesting. You're like, okay, so what do you exactly believe?
Yeah. Jesus, man.
Love. All you need is love.
But that's a good point too. And I think the emergent church movement, if I had to guess, I would put it as a subset category of the progressive church movement. Because progressive Christianity has been around for a very long time. And I think the emergent church, at least in the way we're talking about it, although it's been very popular in the last 40 or 50 years, it has been around for maybe 100, just the ideas here. But yeah, it's very interesting. And I think and it's a big gray area too, because I do know a lot of solid people in ministry that probably fall into the emergent church movement to some respect, whether it's I don't want to publicly write out all of my doctrinal statements and beliefs because I'm afraid that I'm going to alienate somebody. Like I know people that are
non-denominational or
yeah. And one could argue the modern day non-denominational church movement could be the another subset of the emergent church movement,
or like a kind of result of it, whether they would associate or not. Like I wonder, I just wonder. Like I don't know. I am not a church historian, and I would want how long has the whole non-denominational thing been around? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
And are there?
I would
I mean,
guess
I guess
not too
there
long.
are some like emergent churches that maybe still subscribe to like a denomination, but a lot of them do fall under this category of like non-denominational community church kind of thing. I don't know. It is interesting, the whole non-denominational thing. Yeah, I wonder how long that's been around and how much of it was influenced by, if not by the emergent church, some of the same things that influenced the emergent church maybe led to and influenced the whole kind of non-denominational thing.
Now that I think about it, we should have had like an older millennial on this episode today to talk about. But
older millennial. I'm still technically a millennial.
we're the young millennials. But back to our point here, when we make doctrine an unimportant part of church life, we're ultimately saying that your experiences are more important than the truths that we believe or confess. So the truths we believe should be the truths that we publicly confess, right? So doctrine is important. Mm-hmm. The gospel is God's word, God's truth, and it's the gospel that's the power of God and salvation.
It offends me.
Well, and if it offends you, I'm sorry, but those sick guitar riffs, cool lighting, and fog are not going to save you.
That offends me.
But the preaching of God's word, Christ crucified, we have the promise from God that will not return void, right? His word will not return empty, Isaiah 55:11. It's sharper than any two-edged sword, Hebrews 4:12. And if that's the truth, and if we actually believe that, well, why do we discount it so much? Why do we bury doctrine if the preaching of these truths are the only thing that will actually help save sinners, that will actually help them come to a saving faith in Jesus Christ? Like, so often I see interviews with people where, they say they believe these things, but the way they actually do church says something completely different. And that's hard. And that's one of the harsh realities that I see with the emergent church movement.
Do you ever look at those like type of churches and settings with the fog lights and like the like LED like sophisticated background and the stage lighting and all this stuff, and like just think it looks so bizarre. Like, and I guess like if that's what you're used to, you probably wouldn't think that way. And not that I was ever into anything like that extreme, but like I don't know. When I look at that, like what?
I see that as an elevating of the pastors and whoever's on stage to be above whoever is on the floor.
Because the congregation is just blacked out, right? It's got black ceilings, dim lights, and the emphasis is up on stage with like. But I just like, why fog machines? Why LED light? Like, laser beam, like, it reminded me like when we went to the Oxford's Red concert. Yeah, like, but it's literally like almost the same thing as a concert. I don't know. It's very odd to me. Like, why do you like? What makes you want to make that a setting for a worship service? I don't know. Again, maybe someone who's used to it wouldn't think of it as odd, as bizarre. For me, I look at that and like, what? I just don't get it. I don't know.
Well, you look at churches, say like Elevation Church, where this is the case, where the congregation is blacked out. They have all this cool lighting, the fogs, they have the great band, the great musician. You got Stephen Furtick, and all of them are elevated to this, like, I'm going to say priestly status, where they are more than, so in a way, like, are we idolizing people we shouldn't be idolizing? And I think it's really tempting to do that when you have these kinds of situations, which leads us to our conversation next week on celebrity pastors. Indeed. But so it'll be interesting. But anyway, harsh reality. The emergent church movement, while it does reference churches in this schema over the last 30 to 40 years, it has reflected a long history of the church conforming to culture. You even see that in the scriptures. But Marcus Borg, who unfortunately has been a prominent voice of progressive Christianity, said this. He said, the emerging paradigm has been visible for well over 100 years. And just interesting that it's existed longer than what we really have experienced. In reality, the desire to conform, like I mentioned earlier, has been around for a very long time, and we must be on guard, right? If you're a ministry leader, really ask yourself, is what I'm doing, am I doing it for the edification and the discipleship of the saints? Or Is it to enhance the experience just to get more people in the door? Ask yourself that and be honest with it. And I think that can be convicting for a lot of us I've worked in ministry for a long time, and I would be lying to you if I said that.
Yeah.
I've never thought about the second question there.
It's interesting, this whole thing, getting people in the door. It just got me thinking. I was in a development meeting in an association that I'm in. I worked at a Christian camp, and so all the development people, we had a speaker in who's a consultant, was a pastor for many years, seems like a very godly man. But he's talking about some of the churches he's worked with, and it's just interesting. Like I guess it's practically for the life of the church. I guess the function of the church, it makes sense, right? Like if you hire someone, they have to kind of pay for themselves in a sense. But just that idea seems a little odd. Like, okay, well, we bring in a youth pastor, then we expect it to grow this much, and I don't know. Like, is that? There's something about, like, when I was just thinking, like, okay, yeah, I see that practically somewhat, but it also just seems odd to speak about it in those terms. It seems kind of so corporate.
Well, what are we putting on the value of that pastor, right? So if we're bringing in a pastor,
if we brought in a pastor, like his success, would it be merited on the fact that X amount of people started coming and giving more faithfully? And is that, that could be a good thing. Like, one, he's preaching really well and biblically, and people come because of that. And as they grow in their faith in the Lord, and they grow to understand a biblical, understanding of stewardship, they are giving more faithfully and generously. Like, that could be it. Or is it just like, we're attracting more people, so because he attracted more people, he's successful? I don't know. I don't have an answer on that. And again, I seem like a very godly, biblical man. It was just and maybe it was just that setting, but I didn't like seeing that side. I haven't been on any form of like church, like a church government in that sense. Well, where a lot of people, they don't have a church government. It's more of a, like, they even use a business term, right?
Yeah.
Like, maybe that's common talk and lingo, but to me, it was weird to hear the church being referenced in such a corporate and business-like way, and it just made it felt a little consumeristic. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and that's important, right? If we think that we've hired a new pastor and it's successful because 50% or because we have a 50% increase in attendance, like we're probably looking at the wrong place, right? So you probably want to look at the quality of the preaching of the word and how well he's discipling and shepherding the flock.
Could that growth because he's doing what God has called him to do? Like, I hope so. I'm just saying.
Absolutely.
It just was, I don't know. It was very strange.
Discernment, man.
Yeah.
But what can we learn from our discussion on the emergent church, right? So what lessons can we take away through this conversation? I think number one is that our carnal desires and preferences should not be the driving force of change in the local church, right? What we want, just as far as our preferences and making the church leadership more of a business-like structure and making it more like a concert or entertainment, that should not be the driving force of change, right? Another thing that we can learn is that we should never be passive consumers of the church, but instead we should be active participants, warriors that are training for battle against the principality of the air, right? So we have an active role in the church, and we shouldn't take that lightly. Another lesson is that doctrine and truth should be at the forefront of our churches, not buried where no one can find it. So while having a good experience is important, we should never craft our services solely to tickle the ears of those who attend. Because what does 2 Timothy say? It says this, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate for themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to the truth and wander off into myths. So how do we combat that? It comes in the verse right before that. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. So I think that's interesting as we close out here, that these are the things we need to be paying attention to with the emergent church movement.
Can't you hear Pastor Drew like me saying that? Preach the word. I just hear his voice because he always said that verse.
I always hear Stephen Lawson.
Stephen Lawson, yeah.
All right. So I think that's it for our discussion today. Next week, we're going to be talking about the concept of celebrity pastors and how does that actually look? Is it healthy? Is it not? We know that a lot of it comes from this emergent church movement, but there's some overlap too. So join us for our conversation next week. But thank you for joining us today on the Happy Holy Hour. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our email is happyholyhour@gmail.com. We'd be happy to connect with you, even on social media. Just reach out. We'd be stoked to talk to you. Remember to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Leave a review so others can find the show. And lastly, if you are feeling called to donate, to give generously to the show, we would greatly appreciate that. It helps us go another week.
Not a pyramid scheme.
It's not a pyramid scheme. And this week, we want to highlight one of our Patreon givers, Seth Miller. Thank you for giving. Thank you for being generous. You help us do what we do, and we appreciate you. And if you're looking for ways to give, you can find them on our website, thehappyholyhour.org. Lastly, visit our website for some really helpful resources. Until next week.
Stay hip, church.
God bless.